Once the words fear not are truly revealed to you, not merely heard or repeated, but inwardly recognized, everything in life begins to change. These words are not advice offered by the human mind, nor are they a command demanding effort. They are a revelation of a spiritual fact. They announce that fear has no authority, no law, no reality in the presence of truth. Most of humanity lives under the assumption that fear is natural, unavoidable, and even necessary. Fear of loss, fear of sickness, fear of failure, fear of the future quietly governs thought and shapes experience. Yet the moment fear not is revealed within, we begin to see that fear has never been a power in itself. It exists only as a belief sustained by ignorance of our true nature. Fear thrives where truth is not yet recognized. It cannot survive in awareness. When spiritual understanding dawns, fear is not fought or suppressed, it simply fades, as darkness disappears when light is present. This is why no struggle is required, no battle is fought. Fear ends not because we resist it, but because we outgrow it. Fear is not something that comes from outside of us, nor is it an invading force imposed by circumstances, people, or events. Fear arises the moment a belief is accepted into consciousness and treated as truth. It is not born from reality itself, but from an interpretation of reality filtered through misunderstanding. When the mind accepts a false premise about life, identity, or safety, fear naturally follows as a byproduct of that belief. This is why fear can exist even in the absence of actual danger, and why it can disappear even when circumstances remain unchanged. The belief at the root of fear is usually the assumption of separation. The moment consciousness accepts the idea that life is divided into opposing forces, that good must constantly defend itself against evil, or that one is a fragile being living at the mercy of unpredictable conditions, fear gains a foothold. It is not the condition that produces fear, but the meaning assigned to it. Two people may face the same situation, yet only one experiences fear, revealing that fear is not in the event, but in the belief held about it. Fear persists because it is continually reinforced by habitual thinking. Thoughts accepted repeatedly become internal agreements, and these agreements shape perception. When consciousness believes in lack, danger, illness, or loss as real powers, fear becomes a logical response within that framework. But once it is seen that these are beliefs rather than laws, fear begins to loosen its grip. Fear cannot survive independent investigation because it has no substance of its own. It feeds on assumption, not truth. Understanding fear as a belief rather than an enemy changes the entire approach to dealing with it. There is no longer a need to fight fear, suppress it, or escape from it. Struggle only gives fear importance and confirms its reality. Instead, awareness gently questions the belief supporting it. When consciousness recognizes that fear is self, generated through mistaken acceptance, it begins to withdraw energy from it. What is no longer believed loses influence. This recognition brings responsibility, not blame. It is not about condemning oneself for feeling fear, but about seeing clearly how fear operates. The moment consciousness stops giving fear permission to define reality, fear weakens. It cannot argue for itself, it has no voice without belief. Just as a shadow cannot exist without an object blocking light, fear cannot exist without a belief obstructing understanding. As spiritual awareness deepens, consciousness begins to rest in what is real rather than what is imagined. Fear fades not because circumstances are controlled, but because the belief that circumstances have ultimate power is dissolved. What remains is clarity, steadiness, and an inner sense of security that does not depend on external conditions, arising naturally as false beliefs are gently released from consciousness. Fear dissolves when spiritual awareness replaces mental struggle, because fear is fundamentally a product of the mind clinging to illusion rather than a reflection of reality. The human mind, trained to evaluate, judge, and anticipate, interprets events and circumstances as threats to its well-being. It imagines danger, magnifies uncertainty, and projects worst-case scenarios. This creates tension, worry, and anxiety, all of which are forms of fear. Yet this fear is not real in the ultimate sense. It exists only as long as the mind identifies with separation, limitation, and vulnerability. When spiritual awareness is awakened, it provides a perspective that transcends the reasoning mind, revealing that fear is unnecessary and unreal. Mental struggle arises from the belief that one must control life, prevent loss, or manipulate outcomes to feel safe. The mind becomes a battlefield where resistance, worry, and defense constantly clash with circumstances, relationships, or perceived threats. Struggle itself is a form of energy that feeds fear, giving it more presence and influence than it would otherwise hold. Every effort to outthink or outmaneuver fear only reinforces its power, because the mind treats the imagined danger as real. In contrast, spiritual awareness is not engaged in a struggle. It recognizes the futility of resistance and rests in a higher knowing that perceives truth beyond appearances. Spiritual awareness is the recognition that life is governed by a principle greater than the individual mind. It sees that the source of being, the infinite presence underlying all things, is orderly, harmonious, and benevolent. This understanding does not deny challenges or apparent difficulties, but it changes the way they are experienced. What once seemed threatening now appears as a moment in which divine intelligence can operate, and the mind no longer reacts with panic or tension. Fear begins to dissolve naturally because it is no longer reinforced by mental struggle. The mind stops clinging to illusion as if it were reality. When fear is confronted with awareness, it cannot maintain its influence. Awareness illuminates the false assumptions that underlie fear, that life is dangerous, that control is necessary, or that the self is vulnerable. As these assumptions are seen clearly, fear loses its substance. It is not replaced by effort or willpower. Rather, it simply evaporates as sunlight dispels mist. This is why spiritual awareness does not need to attack fear. It does not need to fight what is already unreal. Recognition alone is sufficient to transform consciousness. The replacement of mental struggle with awareness allows peace, clarity, and confidence to emerge. Decision-making becomes guided rather than reactive. Challenges are met with calm understanding, and the sense of threat diminishes. Life no longer appears as a series of dangers to navigate, but as a continuous unfolding of opportunities for presence and understanding. Fear dissolves not because circumstances change, but because consciousness has shifted. The mind is no longer at war with itself, and what once dominated thought loses its grip naturally. This is the transformative power of spiritual awareness over fear and struggle. Fear not is a divine invitation to rest in inner knowing, because it points directly to a reality beyond the mind's constant calculation and worry. Most of human life is lived in reaction to uncertainty, in attempts to predict outcomes, and in strategies to control events. These attempts arise from the assumption that security and fulfillment exist outside ourselves, in conditions, possessions, or other people. This assumption gives rise to fear because the mind perceives threats to these external anchors as threats to survival. When the phrase "fear not" is truly understood, it is an invitation to step out of this reactive state and recognize that true security has always been within, untouched by external circumstances. It is a call to awaken to a reality that is unshakable, to a knowing that cannot be threatened, and to a peace that is not dependent on anything outside of oneself. To rest in inner knowing means to recognize that the presence which governs life is ever present and wholly reliable. It is not something to be achieved, earned, or discovered through effort alone. It is already accessible in every moment, but it requires a shift in attention away from the illusions of fear and toward the recognition of what is eternal. When consciousness turns inward and acknowledges this presence, fear loses its foothold. The mind no longer needs to struggle with imagined dangers because it is aligned with a deeper intelligence that knows life is harmonious, orderly, and guided. This inner knowing is not intellectual, it is experiential. It is the quiet recognition that nothing real can be lost, and nothing unreal has power. The human tendency is to rely on effort, planning, and resistance as tools to feel safe. Yet these strategies often amplify fear rather than diminish it. The more one struggles to control life, the more one encounters resistance, unpredictability, and uncertainty, which fuels the cycle of fear. Fear not interrupts this cycle. It is not a suggestion to ignore challenges or deny reality. Rather, it is an invitation to see from a higher vantage point, where challenges are no longer threats but opportunities for the expression of wisdom, presence, and love. Resting in inner knowing shifts perception so that life is no longer interpreted as a series of dangers to defend against, but as a flow in which one participates with trust and clarity. This rest does not require the elimination of thought or effort, but the recognition that thought is not the ultimate authority. Decisions and actions can still be made, but they are guided by an intelligence that is far greater than fear-driven thinking. Fear not is a reminder that the mind is a tool, not a ruler, and that when we surrender the illusion of control, we align with the presence that has always cared, guided, and sustained. From this place, fear cannot dictate experience, because experience is now interpreted through the lens of truth rather than belief. Inner knowing transforms fear into trust, struggle into flow, and tension into peace. It is a shift that does not depend on changing circumstances, but on awakening to the reality that life is inherently safe and the self is inherently secure. True safety is found in spiritual identity, not in circumstances, because the essence of who we are transcends the fleeting events and conditions of the external world. Most people define security by what they possess, where they live, or the relationships they maintain, assuming that stability in these areas guarantees protection. Yet circumstances are inherently uncertain and subject to change. Illness, loss, disappointment, and unpredictability can touch anyone at any time. When safety is sought in the external world, fear inevitably follows, because these things are impermanent and beyond complete control. True safety, however, is discovered within, in the recognition of one's eternal nature and the presence of a guiding intelligence that underlies all life. This spiritual identity is not limited by events, unaffected by outcomes, and unshaken by conditions. It is the foundation upon which all genuine security rests. Spiritual identity is the understanding that the self is more than a temporary body, a collection of roles, or a personality shaped by circumstance. It is the recognition that the core of our being is whole, complete, and aligned with the universal source of life, which is inherently orderly, loving, and unchangeable. When consciousness rests in this truth, external events no longer dictate emotional or mental stability. Challenges are no longer experienced as threats, because the foundation of identity is unshakable. Safety is no longer conditional or dependent on what happens outside. It is a state of being rooted in what is eternal and real. Fear arises when the mind identifies with vulnerability, limitation, and impermanence. The mind believes that safety is earned, maintained, or defended against loss. This creates constant tension, worry, and attempts at control. But the moment spiritual identity is recognized, fear loses its authority. The mind can no longer dominate experience with imagined dangers, because the self now perceives that true protection comes a source that cannot fail. Safety is not something to be acquired or fortified. It is realized by turning inward and resting in the truth of existence beyond conditions. Living from spiritual identity transforms every aspect of life. Decisions are made from clarity rather than panic. Actions are guided by wisdom rather than reaction. And relationships are approached from presence rather than dependency. The world is still experienced, but it is no longer a source of fear, because it is seen as a manifestation of the underlying intelligence that already ensures the well-being of all. Life is approached with confidence, not bravado, because confidence now comes from knowing who you are rather than from controlling what surrounds you. True safety and spiritual identity also invites trust. Trust is not blind optimism. It is the quiet assurance that life itself is orderly and harmonious, that each moment is supported by the same presence that sustains all existence. When fear is replaced by this recognition, anxiety dissolves, Tension eases and peace becomes the natural state of being. Safety is no longer external, temporary, or fragile. It is the eternal reality of the self, resting in the awareness that nothing real can be threatened and nothing unreal has power. From this recognition, life is lived freely, courageously, and without the burden of fear. Peace appears when we stop resisting life and begin trusting presence, because resistance is the root of struggle, tension, and inner conflict. Most people approach life as though it must be controlled, managed, or defended against, believing that happiness and safety depend on shaping events to match personal expectations. This approach creates a constant friction between what is and what the mind thinks should be. Resistance takes many forms: worry about the future, regret over the past, judgment of circumstances, or attempts to manipulate outcomes. All of these mental efforts arise from a belief that the mind itself can secure well-being. The more we resist life, the more we amplify fear, frustration, and anxiety, because resistance assumes a lack in the present moment and fights against reality rather than embracing it. Trusting presence is the antidote to this resistance. Presence is the awareness of the infinite, intelligent, and loving force that pervades all life. It is the recognition that existence itself is ordered, harmonious, and guided, even when the human mind cannot perceive it. Trust in this presence does not ignore difficulties or pretend that challenges do not exist. Rather, it acknowledges that life flows according to a principle far greater than individual understanding. When consciousness rests in this trust, tension dissolves naturally because the mind stops struggling against what is. Instead of reacting with fear or control, we respond from alignment with a deeper wisdom that governs every moment. This is why peace appears spontaneously when resistance ceases. The mind no longer battles illusions, and life is experienced through clarity and ease. Resistance often arises from attachment to outcomes, identities, or external conditions. The human mind clings to what it desires and rejects what it fears, generating inner turbulence whenever reality does not conform. Peace cannot coexist with this clinging because it is dependent on external forms for validation. Trusting presence shifts attention inward, away from outcomes and toward the eternal source of all life. When this shift occurs, circumstances can change without disturbing the inner state. Challenges are still present, but they are met with composure, discernment, and understanding. Life becomes a cooperative flow rather than a constant battle, because the mind has released the illusion of control and surrendered to a higher intelligence. When resistance is replaced by trust, consciousness opens to guidance, insight, and inspiration that the fearful mind cannot access. Fear thrives in resistance because it feeds on uncertainty and the illusion of separation. Trust in presence removes the foundation for fear, as the mind begins to recognize that all events are supported and that the self is secure in the underlying reality of existence. This does not create passivity, it creates alignment. Actions are no longer frantic or forced, but arise naturally from clarity and understanding. Decisions are made with confidence, and life unfolds with a sense of cooperation rather than conflict. Peace emerges as a natural state when resistance ends because consciousness is no longer divided. There is no inner struggle, no opposition to what is, and no anxiety about what may come. Trust in presence becomes the anchor, and life is lived in rhythm with the infinite intelligence that underlies all being. In this state, fear, tension, and doubt dissolve, leaving a quiet assurance and a profound sense of harmony. The cessation of resistance and the embracing of trust reveal that peace was always present, waiting only for the mind to release its struggle and rest in the reality of what truly is. Transformation begins when fear is seen as unreal in the light of truth, because fear only has power as long as it is accepted as real. Most of human experience is governed by beliefs and assumptions, many of which are mistaken. The mind perceives threats, dangers, and limitations as if they are absolute, and this perception generates fear. Yet these threats exist only in thought, in the interpretations and projections of consciousness. When fear is recognized as unreal, when it is understood that it arises from mistaken belief rather than from actual conditions, its hold on life begins to dissolve. Transformation occurs naturally because the mind is no longer feeding an illusion. Energy that was previously consumed by fear is now available to support clarity, presence, and alignment with reality. Fear thrives on identification. When a person believes that they are vulnerable, separate, or at the mercy of events, fear appears to be justified. Every worry, every anxious thought, every imagined disaster reinforces the sense of limitation and strengthens the grip of fear. Yet the moment consciousness shifts to see the falseness of these assumptions, the apparent power of fear vanishes. Seeing fear as unreal does not mean ignoring circumstances or pretending danger does not exist. It means recognizing that nothing real can threaten the self and nothing unreal has power. This recognition is the seed of transformation because it changes the way reality is interpreted, and it changes the way energy is applied in life. Energy previously bound in tension, resistance, and defensive thinking is liberated for creativity, insight, and peace. Transformation also occurs because recognizing fear as unreal removes the struggle against it. Many people attempt to suppress or fight fear, believing that effort alone will eliminate it. This struggle paradoxically strengthens fear, giving it attention and reinforcing its imagined reality. But when fear is understood as unreal, it no longer requires resistance. It no longer demands attention or justification. It simply dissolves when illuminated by truth, like shadows vanishing in sunlight. This process transforms consciousness because the mind begins to operate from reality rather than from projection and assumption. Life is experienced with a sense of freedom, clarity, and ease that was previously obscured by imagined threats. Furthermore, seeing fear as unreal opens the door to higher understanding and spiritual growth. Fear keeps consciousness contracted, focused on limitations, and preoccupied with self-preservation. Once fear is recognized as a mental construct rather than an absolute truth, consciousness expands. Awareness turns toward truth, presence, and the eternal nature of being. This expansion brings insight into the deeper principles that govern life, revealing a reality in which order, intelligence, and harmony are always present. Transformation is the natural consequence because life is no longer interpreted through the lens of limitation and threat, but through the lens of truth and possibility. Ultimately, the transformation that begins when fear is seen as unreal is profound and comprehensive. It reshapes perception, shifts consciousness, and reorients life from anxiety and resistance to trust and presence. Fear loses its authority, clarity emerges where confusion once reigned, and energy is released to support growth, action, and peace. This transformation is not gradual effort, but the natural unfolding that occurs when the light of truth shines on what was once mistaken for reality. It is the awakening to the freedom, security, and wholeness that were always present, only obscured by the illusion of fear. The essence of this teaching is that fear, as it is commonly experienced, is never a reality in itself, but a product of mistaken belief and misperception. Life is often approached as a battlefield where circumstances, challenges, and other people are seen as threats to be managed, controlled, or defended against. Fear appears natural in such a worldview because the mind interprets uncertainty as danger and vulnerability as risk. Yet when consciousness begins to shift, when fear is seen not as an absolute force but as an illusion born of thought, a remarkable transformation begins. This is the foundation of the revelation contained in Fear Not, the understanding that fear only has power when it is believed to be real, and that true freedom, peace, and safety exist beyond the mind's assumptions and projections. Fear thrives on identification with limitation, separation, and vulnerability. It is reinforced by habitual thinking, by clinging to outcomes, and by attempts to control the uncontrollable. The human mind interprets every challenge as a threat, and in doing so it amplifies tension and suffering. Yet fear is not self-existent. Its power is dependent entirely on the mind's acceptance of it. The moment awareness recognizes that fear is unreal, that it is a mental construct rather than a law of life, the energy supporting fear begins to dissolve. This recognition does not require struggle or suppression, it requires only clarity and understanding. As the illusion of fear is exposed, consciousness is freed to rest in the truth of what is real, in the ever-present source of life that is ordered, harmonious, and benevolent. Transformation unfolds naturally when fear is illuminated by truth. As fear loses its grip, the mind no longer reacts compulsively or defensively, and life begins to be experienced from a place of presence rather than reaction. Spiritual awareness replaces mental struggle, and peace emerges because the mind is no longer at war with reality. Challenges and circumstances may remain unchanged, yet they no longer dominate experience, because the inner state is rooted in what is eternal, not in what is temporary. Decisions are guided by clarity rather than anxiety, and action arises naturally, in alignment with intelligence and order greater than the individual self. Life is no longer interpreted as a series of threats, but as a continuous unfolding in which divine wisdom operates freely. True safety, security, and fulfillment are found not in possessions, achievements, or external circumstances, but in the recognition of spiritual identity. When consciousness rests in this inner knowing, fear loses its foundation. Life is approached with trust rather than control, and resistance gives way to cooperation with the flow of existence. The more fear is seen as unreal and replaced by awareness of presence, the more energy is liberated for clarity, creativity, and love. This is the essence of the transformation. The mind is freed from illusion, the heart is opened, and life becomes an expression of peace, confidence, and alignment with truth. In conclusion, the revelation of fear not is not a mere instruction, it is a profound awakening. Fear is seen for what it truly is, a belief, a projection, a shadow of misunderstanding. When it is exposed to awareness, it dissolves, giving rise to peace, trust, and freedom. Transformation begins from within, as consciousness shifts from reaction to understanding, from struggle to rest, and from limitation to recognition of the eternal nature of being. Life changes not because circumstances are altered, but because perception is. What once seemed threatening now becomes an opportunity for insight, alignment, and presence. Fear no longer dictates thought, action, or experience. Instead, life flows through consciousness unencumbered, guided by intelligence, supported by order, and illuminated by truth. The moment fear not is truly revealed within, everything begins to change, because consciousness itself awakens to its eternal, unshakable, and infinite nature. In this awakening, fear disappears, peace prevails, and life is lived in freedom.